All right, and welcome. We are starting with our next section of Unit 8, and we're going into neurodevelopmental disorders as well as schizophrenia. All right, so we're going to start off. Just put this at the top. Here's a little reminder to skip a line after every big concept, and then please make sure to pause and list all the information that is being given to you, and then make sure that you are writing down everything. All right. So we're going to start. So what exactly is a neurodevelopmental disorder? And the first thing you need to write down is that this is basically a condition that is associated with the central nervous system and its functioning. Okay? And this is when it usually begins is in early childhood. And this is usually when you see already kids that are about sometimes months, if not a year old, 2 years, and a little bit older as they get. All right. This usually what it includes is a developmental deficit that is going to affect their social, intellectual, academic, and or their own personal functioning. Okay. And under neurodevelopmental disorder, there are four that we're going to talk about. Well, we're going to talk about three, but there's four here. And they are intellectual development, autism spectrum disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and tic disorder. Okay, now we're gonna start with the first one, which is going to be intellectual development disorder. Now, just because I have two little bullets does not mean that's all you're going to be writing. So please make sure that you're including everything. So what exactly is an intellectual developmental disorder? And this is basically when there is a deficit in the general mental abilities, okay, of the child. And this is either in intellectual functioning or adaptive behaviors, okay? And you need to know that an intellectual functioning, okay, that's the next bullet, is going to be what they're referring to is the ability to learn, problem solving, and reasoning. Okay, so if they are functioning below their age, then they would be considered having an intellectual function problem. Then they also have to have the adaptive behaviors. Okay, and the adaptive behaviors are social, practical, which is everyday stuff, like personal hygiene, getting dressed, tying their shoes, and then conceptual skills as well. Okay. Now, they used to diagnose this disorder with just IQ, and that is not what they're doing anymore. They've kind of removed that as a basis, and now what they look for is are they have they developed adaptive functioning skills. Okay, so that's intellectual development disorder. Then we're going to go into autism spectrum disorder, and one that's been talked about a lot in our society. Maybe some of you might have experience with a child with autism as well as adults with autism. And I will say, if you meet one child with autism, you've only met one child with autism. And again, this is because this is a spectrum disorder. There is a huge spectrum with children, so it kind of just depends where they land. But in order to be diagnosed here, so this is basically where they're going to center on a repetitive behaviors as well as impairment of social communication and interaction. Okay, that's kind of like the main things with autism spectrum disorder. But they show impairment in the ability to do some of the following, okay? And they are social and emotional interactions or exchange, which means that they may have the inability to participate in the typical day-to-day, like give and take, right? Their pragmatic abilities of speech, which is that back and forth, knowing when to take turns, is something that they have not been able to develop. They also have difficulties having conversations or understanding and responding to normal social cues. Okay, so that's one aspect of it. Another one is going to be the understanding and using of nonverbal communication, such as body language, eye contact, facial expressions. Okay, and then they also have a difficulties developing and or maintaining social relationships. Okay, then they also may include repetitive motion and speech, as well as using objects or ritualizing patterns of behavior. Okay, some of them may have some extreme sensitivity to sensory stimulation from the environment, such as maybe their clothing, certain textures. So it could vary amongst any of these children. Some may have like sensory, like touch, but some of hearing, and they could go from mild to profound. So it's such a huge spectrum, and it's quite interesting. There's definitely a lot of research going on with the causes of autism, and there's still no known causes. So there's a lot of if it's genetic, it's environment, if it's the foods. So they're definitely researching. There has been some more links to genetics. So that's, being able to give some answers. But the sooner that they catch, especially all of these neural developmental disorders, the sooner they catch this, like the younger the child is, then with therapy, different forms of therapy, such as speech therapy, language, um, occupational therapy, physical therapy, will allow them to then, allow their brains to those neurons to connect and develop, um, develop at a younger age, those things. It's like making those connections, okay? Um, so then we're going on to the next one, which is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, also known as ADHD, another really common one that we hear a lot in our society. All right, and this is basically the persistent inattention and or a persistent display of impulsive behaviors that basically interferes with basic functioning and development. Okay, make sure to pause that. So there could be an inattention, right? There could also be chronic disorganizations, and it doesn't have to be just on the outside. It could definitely be disorganization with their thoughts. There could be lack of focus and the inability to stay on task. Now, there could be hyperactivity, hyperactive behaviors, and hyperactive behaviors can look like fidgeting, running around, feeling restless, difficulty staying still. And then there can also be impulsive behaviors, which are basically actions taken without thinking about them, maybe impulsively hitting or interrupting others or throwing objects. Okay, and again, it could look so different with with people with ADHD. And one important thing, it definitely has to happen in more than one setting. So it just can't be, let's say, in the classroom because they can't sit still. It has to happen in a multiple settings. Okay. And that's basically it for neurodevelopmental disorders. We're going to move on now to schizophrenia. And this one is going to have a lot of information. So please make sure to pause it and write down that information so you fully understand, to really understand and grasp this, because this is one of those disorders that doesn't get talked about as much. It's kind of seen as like, oh my gosh, the more really severe, and it is a really it is a psychological disorder that is definitely in the more severe side, and we'll talk about why that is. So what exactly is schizophrenia? And schizophrenia is a psychological disorder that is characterized by having delusions, hallucinations, disorganized speech, and or diminished or inappropriate emotional expression. Okay, so it's kind of like in a nutshell how it's kind of characterized, and then we'll go a little bit more on what does that mean. And I did want to put here, it is considered a psychotic disorder because it can lead to the person to have a psychosis. And then that psychosis is basically, we've talked about it before, is that it's a person that loses contact with reality. Okay, and there are just a few of those psychological disorders that are considered the psychotic because it leads to psychosis. Okay, it can lead to psychosis. So let's start with the first thing, okay, which is basically, and ignore that whole disorganized thinking thing. This is more like just kind of like a category that it falls under, okay? But the first symptom that needs to be there, and or, right? So it could be either or, are delusions, okay? So delusion is basically a false belief. Often it could be like a persecution, that they're persecuting them, that basically may accompany a psychotic disorder, okay? So what this basically means is that they have a false belief that they're being either followed or they're being persecuted, okay? And the delusion, and here's the thing you need to know about a delusion, is that it's a perception thing. So they can be sitting down and somebody looks at them, and that's really happening. Somebody is looking at them, but the way that they perceive that look will be a false belief that that person may be following them or they're going to do something bad to them, okay? So it tends to be a belief that's more on the paranoid side, but definitely know that a delusion is a perception, right? They're perceiving something that is really happening in real life, but they're perceiving it basically as a threat to themselves. Okay, like something bad is going to happen to them, or they're going to do something to them. Okay, so that's delusions. Then they could have a hallucination. Hallucination is basically a false sensory experience, and this could be from any of their senses. The key here with hallucinations is that it's not happening, right? So delusion, it is happening in the sense of like somebody's looking at them or there's a car behind them, but they perceive it as a danger. Hallucination is that they're having a false sensory experience, which means that they can either, and it could be any of their senses. It could be an auditory, it could be a visual, it could be taste, it could be smell, it could be touch. So any of that, they'll feel that or experience that even though it's not happening in real life, okay? So sometimes, typically in schizophrenia, or you'll have people that have the hallucination is like auditory. So they hear things, they hear voices. They could be seeing things, right, that are not really there. Um, so they can experience that, but they could also experience like touch, and they feel things on their skin even though it may not be there. Okay, so just keep that in mind for what is hallucination. Then the next thing that symptom of a schizophrenia is disorganized speech. And disorganized speech is basically where they're combining their thoughts and words, and they're just talking and they're switching from one thought to another. So just think of like when you guys, like your brain is always like, having all these thoughts, but we, for the most part can like stop and say, okay, let me go to the next, topic. This in disorganized speech, it's just like one thought after another, and they will not make sense. Sometimes it'll switch from one topic to a totally unrelated one, okay? Then they will link words together because they rhyme. And that's called clang association. Okay? I'll write it here, clang association. Okay. And then they also can spew out words that basically they sound like jargon or jumble up their words, and that make no sense. Okay. And then that is called word salad. All right. So this can be um, what they experience. Okay. Then the next one is what they would call grossly disorganized or abnormal motor behavior. All right. And then what that means is basically either abnormal or bizarre physical behaviors. Sometimes it's kind of like childlike mannerisms, such as like twirling their hair or rocking back and forth. Um, so it can be kind of like senseless or even like compulsive behaviors, like acts, or they can have what's called catatonic, and I'll write it here. Catatonic behavior is basically like these really bizarre posture, and kind of it seems like they cannot move, like they're stiff. So sometimes it'll look like that they're really stiff and motionless, and they could go for hours, and they could be in one position for a long period of time, or they can have like a repeated movement, either be it their face or repeating certain words, um, or like not moving at all. Okay, so that's kind of like that catatonic motor function. Okay, and then the last one is a diminished and inappropriate emotions. Okay, and this is basically that their emotions are often inappropriate, that they're not related to what's happening in reality, but they could also have in moments of emotionless, right, state of, and they'll have a flat affect, right, and that's, make sure to write that down. So they'll have like emotionless, flat affect. They may have difficulty perceiving facial emotions from others. They may have their social relationships won't, they won't be able to maintain that, or sometimes even not able to hold a job, relationships. And then many times this will lead to like social withdrawal or isolated. Okay. Now, many times in these psychotic disorders, they have what's called positive symptoms, and then they'll have negative symptoms. Okay, and you need to know the difference between them. So, positive symptom is basically it's marked by a decrease of normal function, okay, for the person. And under schizophrenia, positive symptom is going to be experiencing hallucinations, talking in disorganized or diluted ways, exhibiting inappropriate laughter, tears, or rage, or the presence of inappropriate behaviors. Okay, they could also be delusions as well. Now, the negative symptoms are basically where you have a diminished emotional expression, or what, okay, and then that's going to be like toneless voices, expressionless faces, they're either mute or rigid bodies, the absence of appropriate behaviors or any behaviors, um, and then they also have what's called avolition. Avolition is basically a significant decrease in or absence of any purposeful activity. And what happens with this is that they may sit or stand for long periods of time and basically not moving or showing any interest in participating in any activity. Okay? Um, so definitely empathy there, right? For people struggling with schizophrenia. And we're going on to, there is what's called chronic schizophrenia and acute schizophrenia. Chronic schizophrenia is basically exhibiting persistent and incapacitating negative symptoms, of social withdrawal. Okay, so chronic is just constant. They have the negative symptoms, so obviously is very difficult to socially interact with people. And many times recovery for chronic is very, like, it's very difficult. Okay. And then acute schizophrenia, this one typically it develops quickly. Sometimes it's triggered because of life stresses. And then recovery is obviously more likely. This is typically positive symptoms, okay? And they'll typically use drug therapy, okay? And we'll talk about the different forms of therapy. So understanding schizophrenia. So in order to distinguish schizophrenia from other disorders such as depressive or bipolar disorder, key thing that need to have is there either needs to be delusion and or hallucination, okay? And they have to last at least 2 weeks. So make sure you write that down. This is considered a brain disease because they see that it is in the brain. They have not found the cause of it, but there is some research out there in which they have linked genetics and environmental factors as a cause. There's also abnormally elevated dopamine, and they also have enlarged fluid-filled ventricles of the brain. Okay, so those two things have been linked to people with schizophrenia, and they have found that this disorder affects 1% of the people worldwide, and it is slightly more frequent among males, even though females is about the same. And then they have also found that if one identical twin has it, the other increases its risk by 50%, which basically means that there is a strong genetic link to this. The onset of schizophrenia is typically in the late teens, early 20s. And they say that there's like this um, a quarter thing with schizophrenia, which basically means this, okay? So a quarter of people that develop schizophrenia will have one psychotic episode, but will recover and lead a relatively normal life, okay? So that's one quarter. The other quarter will respond well to medication and be relatively independent. And then there is the other three-fourths that will need to live with supervision in a supportive facility. And the last quarter is the more severe symptoms, and they would require permanent care. All right, and that I hope understands a little bit more. Definitely, we could talk a little bit about how media portrays this, and that you've learned a little bit more on this. All right, I'll see you soon.